Chapter 2. Shut Up. Praying for Death and Black Shoes. There's an amazing story that I've heard on several occasions. Two men were walking down a busy city street, and one said to the other, "Do you hear that cricket chirping?" His friend thought he was crazy. How could anyone hear a cricket chirping amid the noise of the city? Cars, buses, horns, voices, etc. The first man, however, walked over to a nearby stone, gently lifted it up, and sure enough, there was a cricket. His friend asked him, "How could you possibly have heard that cricket in the midst of all this other noise?" He replied, "Watch this." He took a coin from his pocket, threw it up high in the air, and when it hit the sidewalk, everyone within several feet stopped to look for it. At this, the first man replied, "People hear what they want to hear." I believe with all of my heart that each and every one of us can hear God if we want to. There's an inspiring passage in the Bible, 1 Kings chapter 19, where the prophet Elijah was struggling so much that he wanted to die. He even prayed for death. After this prayer, several interesting things happened to him, including an encounter with an angel, eating some food, and doing some traveling. However, God really wanted to speak to him, so God asked him to stand on a mountain. Then he told Elijah that he would be passing by. Some awesome things happened. A strong wind, so powerful that it crushed rocks, an earthquake, and a fire. But for Elijah, God's voice was not heard in any of those things. What happened after all of those dramatic events is that there was a tiny whispering sound. And it was in that whisper that Elijah heard God. There is an awesome woman I know named Sister Carol. She has an incredible job. She's a vocation director, which means that she gets to help people learn to listen to God and help them to discern, which just means prayerfully figuring out what God is calling them to do with their lives. She's taught me a lot of things, but one of the most memorable lessons she's ever taught me is that in order to figure out God's plan for our lives, we need to shut up. I like that. It's always cool when a religious sister tells you to shut up, and I found it to be true and necessary. There's a time in the life of my daughter that I'll never forget. When Audrey was in preschool, she really needed some black shoes for a wedding that she was going to be in. As she and my wife Lisa shopped, they simply could not find anything in Audrey's size that we could afford. Frustrated, Lisa stopped outside of a store on a sidewalk and prayed with Audrey. "Jesus, if you could help us to find some shoes for Audrey, that would be great." As soon as this prayer ended, Audrey looked into her mother's eyes and confidently said, "He said yes." Sure enough, they found just the right shoes in the very next store. If you're like me, you may not have Audrey's childlike faith, and you may have trouble shutting up when you pray. It may be difficult for you to hear that quiet, whispering voice of God, perhaps because there's so much noise all around you, and perhaps you're simply not tuned into God. Perhaps you've even wondered if God still speaks to his people. Maybe you believe that God does still speak to some people, but only to those really special and holy people, like biblical figures, saints, and church leaders. Maybe you don't really believe deep down in your heart that God cares enough to speak to you. If you've ever felt any of those feelings, you're not alone. I have too. But I have great news for you. God still does want to speak to us. We just need to listen. As the first story in this chapter highlights, a big part of the reason that so few of us in today's world can hear God is that we live in such a busy and noisy world. There's always so much to do, and there seems to be constant noise everywhere and at all times. Radio, conversations, video games, music, TV, MP3 players, computers, and constant activity fills most of our lives. When we hop into our cars to go somewhere, most of us immediately turn on the radio, or we pop in a CD. Don't worry, I'm not saying that these things are always bad. My goal in life is definitely not to be your travel agent for a guilt trip. I think we've been on enough of those already. And I readily admit that these noises constantly surround me too, and they can be good and fun when used appropriately. However, as you certainly know, they can also consume our time so much that we're seldom at rest and rarely silent. So I have a challenge for you and for myself. I want to encourage us to try to spend at least some time in complete and total silence, in the presence of God, every day for the rest of our lives. It may just be those couple of minutes in bed before falling asleep. If we could do this, I'm confident it would settle our souls and give God the opportunity to speak to our hearts. If listening to God is something that you're willing to try, please know this. Even when we try our hardest to listen, there are times when God won't say anything, and this can feel pretty weird. Even on a very human level, I found this to be true. Early on in any relationship with anyone I've ever known, silence can be awkward. But don't worry about it a bit if God seems to be silent with you. Just enjoy being in His presence. Take it from someone who's been in love, and who still is madly in love, by the way, that when you love anyone, it's not always all about the words that you say. Sometimes it's enough just to be quiet in the presence of someone that you care deeply about. Early in my relationship with my wife Lisa, we seemed to talk to each other constantly because we were getting to know one another and were kind of uncomfortable with too much silence. But now that we know one another better, sometimes we just love to sit and be with each other. God has known you your whole life, even if you haven't known Him very well, and He may just want to be with you and teach you how to just be quiet and be with Him. There's a great Bible verse about this where God says, "Be still and know that I'm God." That being said, there are two main reasons why I think we should try to listen to God and give Him the chance to speak to our hearts. The first reason is that God is really smart. God is way smarter than you and way smarter than me. The theological term for this is omniscient, which means that God knows everything. No human being is that smart. I need more smarts because, quite honestly, I often feel kind of dumb and clueless about my life. And so listening to God will make me less dumber than I am, which I really need, as you can probably tell from this sentence. The second reason I think it's important to listen to God is because He's my creator, and the creator of anything knows best how it works and how it operates. Take my car, for example. Not literally, of course, because I need it to get around. But to illustrate the point, I want to tell you about my car. My Corolla was made by the Toyota Corporation. So naturally, they know how it operates best, how to take care of it, and how to get the most out of it. To help me out, the dealer even gave me an owner's manual when I bought the car. Similarly, God, my creator, can advise me on how to best operate my life, how to take care of myself, and how to live life to the fullest. God has graciously given an owner's manual to us for our lives, and I've devoted an entire chapter of this book to that. The very next chapter, by the way. Here's the deal. If we listen to God, and if we are willing to cooperate with what God speaks to our hearts, we can gradually uncover His plan for our lives. Yep, it's true. We can discover God's vision for our lives. And God's vision for our lives is extremely important to know. It's far better than our own vision for our lives could ever be, and will really make a difference in this world, as you'll discover in a later chapter of this book called John and Amber's Keg Party. The title of that chapter and what it contains are so intriguing that I wouldn't blame you one bit if you just stopped right here, put a bookmark, and went straight to that chapter right now. You see, God cares very deeply about each one of us in a very personal way, especially about the really important things in our lives. The kind of person we are, the kind of person we will become, our relationships with others, our happiness, and our future. The problem is this. Though most people would readily admit that God wants the best for all of these areas, most of us live as if we know better than God. Most people, even those of us who profess a belief in God, will choose a dating partner, a college, a career, a marriage partner, a home, how to spend our money, and then we'll ask God to bless those things. In my experience, though, very few of us ask God first about such things. How many of us have really asked God questions like these? Who do you want me to be friends with, God? Should I date that person, God? Where should I go to school, God? How should I spend my free time, God? How should I spend my money, God? Where do you want me to live, God? God, should I marry this person? And what do you want me to do with the rest of my life, Lord? Even if you've never asked about such things, it's never too late to start. But hold on tight, because life with God is an adventure, and He might lead you to some very interesting, challenging, uncomfortable, and even dangerous places. Don't worry, though. He'll be with you. While it is critically important to ask for God's wisdom about these very important facets of our lives, asking will never do us any good at all unless we listen to God's response. Before I end this chapter, I need to say a few very important words about discernment. As I said earlier, discernment simply means prayerfully figuring out what God wants of us. Before acting upon what we believe God has said to us in our prayer time, especially about really big things in our lives, we need to make sure that it really is God speaking to us. None of us are perfect, and therefore we are all capable of self-deception, thinking that our thoughts are God's thoughts, being innocently misguided, and even being led astray by the power of evil. I recently read a quote from someone who said that the church, meaning us, God's people, has given God a bad name. Sad, but true. Countless people who have claimed to be following God's voice have brought untold pain and tragedy into our world. Just two examples are terrorists who've destroyed innocent human life while believing that they were doing God's will, and church leaders who proclaim messages of hate and intolerance. I've even known people who, quite innocently, thought that they heard God speaking to them and later found out that they were wrong. To help safeguard us against these dangers of not hearing God properly, God has blessed us with several safeguards to help us to discern the voice of God from other voices, including the world, our own desires, and the devil. First of all, God would never ask us to do anything inconsistent with what is taught in the Bible, especially Jesus' divine proclamation to love God and others. And, as I mentioned earlier, we also have the guidance of the church and our church leaders to keep us on the right path. For the big things in life, before immediately following what we perceive to be God's voice, we should always run those ideas past people who love us well, our parents, our good friends, and even a trusted spiritual guide like a pastor, youth minister, or other person who has mature faith. Even though we might be striving to listen to God, we are not the final authority. We need wisdom and guidance to properly discern His voice. Don't forget that, okay? Finally, I would like to close this chapter with this simple reminder: keep listening. If nothing else, you will certainly hear God telling you how much He loves you, and He does, more than you'll ever know. Two quotes to conclude this chapter. Mother Teresa: I always begin my prayer in silence, for it is in the silence of the heart that God speaks. And Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me.